Welcome back to Questions for the Rector. I'm Stephen Heiner, and with us, as always, is the Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary here in Reading, Pennsylvania, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn. Hello, Your Excellency.
Hello, Stephen.
Today, we're going to be talking about the Index of Forbidden Books. What is the Index of Forbidden Books, Your Excellency?
Well, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a whole list of bad books which are formally condemned by the Roman Catholic Church. And there was, before Vatican II, there was something called the Congregation of the Index. And this would be a group of cardinals that would come together and ban certain books and condemn certain books. See?
Is every bad book on the Index?
No, not all, but many are. But not all.
And that's just simply because that congregation couldn't possibly read every single book that's coming out at the time.
Well, especially now. I mean, where do you begin? You would have to have something that looks like the Library of Congress to hold all of it, or some sort of computer that has an infinite capacity to all the bad books. I mean, there's some books that are obviously bad. Pornographic books. The church is not going to put every single pornographic book or magazine or anything. I mean, if you can't figure that out, then you've got problems. But particularly books that are anti-Catholic and that would be subversive of the faith. See, that's what it's looking for mostly.
There was an image there's a book called What is the Index, and I was showing His Excellency different eras in which books were banned, and there's a skull and crossbones, which is also what you'll find when His Excellency is telling you not to take his books. You'll find skull and crossbones there as well. He's lost too many books over the years, and so the threat has to be maintained. And you were remarking, Your Excellency, that if we look, the greatest period of banning was actually 1650 to 1699. Which, people might think, well, wasn't the church, in her glorious time, and why was there so many books being banned?
Well, for two reasons. One, that was the beginning of what we call unbelief. It was the attack on belief in God in general. It was the late 1600s, and that's when you had Bossuet very, very active and responding to those things. It was very common in England. And it's just known as unbelief, where atheism, agnosticism, and various attacks on even belief in God in general. So there was a lot of literature that was generated in that time, and yes, the church was in its tridentine glory, you might say, at that time, and therefore was very vigilant about these things. And I'm sure that's why there were so many books put on the index.
And at that time, we're just after the printing press, so books cannot be made as rapidly as they can now. What I was surprised at, the smallest number in this chart is the 1900 to 1949 period. And I was shocked by this, but you were not surprised.
Not surprised at all. That there should have been so many books from in that period that it should have outweighed all of the others put together, because there has never been such an assault on the Catholic faith as in the first part of the 20th century. The reason we have Vatican II is that the pontificates from Benedict XV, Pius XI, and Pius XII, those three pontificates failed to put into effect the precautions and disciplines that St. Pius X said ought to be taken in order to defeat modernism. Benedict XV, and I may have said this in other interviews, was elected precisely because he was against Pius X's strict rules and aggressive repression against modernism. He thought, although Benedict XV was no modernist, nonetheless, he thought that a softer approach to the modernists would be better in order to draw them back. St. Pius X, in his encyclical Pascendi, says that right at the beginning, that I have tried to deal with them in a might say a soft way. He does. I'm paraphrasing, but that has failed. So I have to take these strong measures against them. But the anti-Pius X party, represented by Della Chiesa, Cardinal Della Chiesa, was in favor of being softer toward the modernists, and that was fatal to the protection of the faith against the modernists. They were determined to overthrow the church just exactly the way they have, exactly by the weakness of the disciplines in those periods.
Now, Della Chiesa, Ratti, Pacelli, did they not observe so for example, when Della Chiesa, Benedict XV, was ruling, did not these future papabile look back and say, I don't like what's going on? Was there no reflection to say, I should probably do things differently? Because obviously Benedict XV was elected to do things differently from Pius X.
Yes, absolutely. And Mary del Val represented the Pius X party, you might say, in
The condemnation
continuation.
department.
Yes, but he was defeated, and he was defeated again, and especially he was a very strong candidate in the 1923.
Cardinal Mary del Val was?
Yes, Mary
Really?
del Val, yes.
Okay.
He was, and Pius XI was elected as a type of compromise candidate between the pro-Pius X and anti-Pius X attitudes. And so he sort of was mixed, you might say. But they still didn't understand. For example, Roncalli, future John XXIII, was summoned to Rome and accused of suspicion of modernism, which was very serious, in 1913 by Cardinal de Lai. In 1925, he was consecrated a bishop in Rome. You see, and then he was chosen for the diplomatic corps under Pius XI, and then he messed that up in Bulgaria. We'll go into that, but and then just to show one career, after he did that and Pius XI put him aside, then he was sent to Constantinople during World War II, where he conducted all sorts of ecumenical. Did a lot of ecumenical things with the Orthodox there, and then after the war, Pius XII made him the nuncio to Paris, to France, and which is an enormous job in the Catholic Church. I mean, this person had a horrible career and showed all of his modernism. He was a modernist when he was a seminarian, and his whole career was modernist. He was made nuncio to Paris, and then because he messed that up too, because he disobeyed Pius XII's instructions to suppress the worker movement, the worker priest movement, then he made him the Patriarch of Venice, which is just a path to the papacy. I mean, it's the next stop on the train is Pope,
right,
when you're Patriarch of Venice. There's a typical example of it, but there were others who rose during that time in a similar way. And one of them was Montini, who was a modernist. He was cited by his bishop in 1926 for saying Mass facing the people in Milan, and he was made Secretary of State by Pius XII, and then he fell into disfavor in the 1950s, and he was sent to Milan, which is the biggest diocese in the whole world, and which is a cardinalatial see, and then. He skipped him in the consistory as a slap on the face, and the first thing that John XXIII did when he got into office was made him a cardinal. Therefore, a path to Rome right away. I mean, Milan, Venice. I mean, at that time in the church, there were the cardinals of Italy were set to be the next pope. And those were the two biggest dioceses in the whole country, So that was very typical. You see, people, the Roman universities in the 1950s were already modernist, right under Pius XII's nose.
Well, I am thinking, so suspect of modernism on my file under the reign of St. Pius X would mean I'm never going anywhere. I'm not going to get a monsignorship. That's it.
You're through.
I'm done.
Yes.
And what that was sort of a mark of you need to get promoted later on under these people. With you mentioned Roncalli, when he went to France, if people didn't know what he was, he asked for the normal prerogative of the kings of France was you could put the cardinal's hat on. He asked the socialist president of France,
and Freemason,
to do it for him.
Yes. Knelt down before him. Yes.
So if anyone had any doubts about him, and so I'm thinking Pius XI is watching this, and oh, this is
That was
fine.
Pius XII.
Pius XII is watching this and saying, no,
Yes.
no problem.
Yes. No. No. The of the three pontificates, Pius XII was the most damaging. And I know he was a very pious man, and his doctrines were absolutely sound. But I have to say, his government of the church was very much lacking, and we have Vatican II because of him.
Is it possible to be lacking in the governance of the church and be a saint?
I don't think so. Your first job is to govern the church, and he spent so much time on what I would say extracurricular activities. Talking about astrology or
He
talking
was really
about,
excited about science.
yes, and then he would stay up the whole night for a talk that he was going to give in order to be informed about it. He was a very intelligent man. And Archbishop Lefebvre said he was always in an ivory tower. You could never see him. You could he was not governing the church. That was his, because I asked him that question, and of course he would know because he was
He
apostolic
worked with
delegate.
him. Yeah.
And he said he was up in another world, might say, and you were dealing always with his subordinates, and so. But that is, your first duty of sanctity is duties of state and life. It's whether you like them or not, whether it's your cup of tea or not. You do your duties of state and life, and the primary duty of the Pope is to protect the Catholic faith.
Some might look at Pope Saint Celestine, Your Excellency, and say, well, he clearly wasn't governing the church very well, but he still managed to be a saint, but not because of the way that he governed the church.
Well, because he had the common sense to resign, you see, and that he wasn't meant for that, and so he resigned. That was the proper thing to do.
Was this inevitable for Pacelli, Your Excellency, insofar as he'd spent his whole clerical career in the bureaucracy in a way that
diplomacy?
That this was how he was going to conduct his pontificate.
Yes, even very early, he was in the diplomatic corps, and his boss, you might say, was Della Chiesa. And I'm sorry, no, his boss was Rampolla, if I'm not mistaken. And but anyway, he was in the diplomatic corps, and in diplomacy, you're always giving away something in order to get something. And there was that idea of, you might say, softness in him, you see. And Pius X was totally uncompromising. But the diplomat is somebody who is ready to compromise, you might say. And he may have brought that into the papacy, and it was that he was soft. Things happened that should not have happened, and things were permitted that should not have been permitted. He was the one that permitted in the 1940s that the seminary books could be in vernacular, for example. That opened up a world of corruption for the modernists at the time, because they didn't want to write in Latin, because you can't do modernism in Latin. See, so you can use all of these modern words and expressions that have all sorts of ambiguous meanings, etc., in modern languages. You see, so that this things like that happened little by little. The modernists just rose, and then he failed to condemn Théodore de Chardin, for example. He failed to sufficiently censure Ratzinger. He was a young theologian at the time in the 50s. Rahner, all of these people were active before the council, and they were saying horrible things in their books. And he didn't do anything about it.
Well, going back to saying horrible things in your books, I don't want to get His Excellency too ill by mentioning too many of these names in a row, but to give some insight into who some of these people were, Your Excellency, this is going in alphabetical order, but people like Blondel, Giordano Bruno, Buonaiuti. What were these people teaching?
Well, Giordano Bruno, I forget what he was teaching, but he got burned at the stake by Clement VIII. Yeah, in the Piazza, it's where the Palazzo Farnese is, and I forget what piazza that is, but
it's a gathering spot for the young people these
and when
days.
The Garibaldi Freemasons and filthy people took over Italy in 1870, the government put a statue of Giordano Bruno there, much to Leo XIII's disgust and protestation. So that was a slap in the face to Roman Catholicism. So that's Giordano. I forget what There's so many heretics. It's just,
Hobbes, Hume.
yes, those are all British Protestants and free thinkers. Hobbes, Hume, various other Bolingbroke. I don't know if he's on there, but
And so people can be condemned for a specific work, but sometimes people can be condemned omnia opera. And what does that mean, Your
omnia
Excellency?
opera means everything they wrote, everything they put to paper is condemned.
That's pretty bad.
That's pretty bad. That means is you have no redeeming factor at all. And sometimes particular works, like a certain category of their works, are condemned. Sometimes a particular work is condemned, and sometimes a book is taken off the index, for one reason or another. But that's up to the congregation of the index.
Yes, looking at some specific works, for example, Rousseau's The Social Contract.
Well, that's awful. I mean, Rousseau.
Because a lot of people use that's so penetrated our consciousness, Your Excellency, people use that very casually and say, well, this is part of the social contract, and implying
Yes.
that, this is something we all signed up for, and
No,
that's how society works.
You have to understand that he copied that from John Locke. There was nothing original in Rousseau. He was a plagiarizer, and he just happened to be a personality and a darling of all of the anti-Catholic movement of the 18th century in France. But he was a dissolute.
Was he the one who left all the children?
The 5 children in Paris for some woman, I think in England or something like that. No, he was horrible. He went crazy at the end of his life. And he was a dissolute, lazy person, and he copied that from John Locke. John Locke said that society is based on a contract between free people who can do whatever they please, as long as they don't in any way disturb the liberty of somebody else. That's John Locke. And then government is made by this. You give up some of your liberty to the government in exchange for their protection, etc. You see, that's the social contract. That is not the way government works. Government is something that is natural law and is intended and willed by God, and the power of government comes from God. It doesn't come from below, it comes from above. So if someone is legitimately elected or selected, or he's the king or something like that, his power to rule is from God, not from the people. You see, and that's
So the social contract reinforces that by saying, if I'm giving up some of my power so that you can rule over us, I am the source of sovereignty. So.
Yes, the people are sovereign. That was condemned by St. Pius X. It was condemned also, I think, by Leo XIII. The people are not sovereign. They are subject to legitimate authority, which derives from God. That's in St. Paul. All right, so all authority comes from God. That's a quote from St. Paul. And so all legitimate authority, and don't forget, he's saying this to Christians living under the Roman emperors. These are, Caligula is one of the, it was terrible. And various others, even Nero. Imagine Nero having the power of God to rule, but that's the church's teaching. I mean, that says nothing about their virtues or vices. It's just that if they rule, they rule, and it's by the power of God. Yes, it has influenced all political thinking from the 18th century on, including American thinking. For example, taxation without representation is tyranny. That's false. The government has, by its very nature, the power to tax its citizens. They don't have to be represented or anything like that. Whatever government is legitimate can tax its citizens.
Just part of me as an American, Your Excellency, was reacting to you allowing there to be any sort of thing positive said about taxes.
I mean, obviously taxation has to be just and equitable, and it cannot be overburdened, burdensome. But the power to tax does not come from below; it comes from above, and it's a necessary part of government that there be a taxation. So, and as I think said in another video, in England, most of the population was not represented in Parliament with regard to taxation. Most of it was not at the time. That was something invented by the Freemasons, who cooked up the in Boston. And they were all influenced by this Rousseauian idea, that the people are sovereign. We just have to understand that about our background, and that's how our politics and our mentality works, and it's based on a false principle.
And I think people also don't see the connections, Your Excellency, that if the social contract exists, that means I can withdraw my consent and we can start a revolution.
Yes,
And that,
it is.
as Thomas Jefferson says, you need to periodically water the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants, etc.
Yes, no, it means it's revolutionism, which is a typically Masonic principle that you can rise up and dump a government whenever you think that, in your opinion, or you get enough people behind you to say, we want something different. And that's wrong too. That's typically Masonic.
So Hobbes and Hume are opera omnia. Kant's critique of pure reason.
Oh, well, Immanuel Kant, he's the devil of the 18th century. He has done more damage. He is the I'll call him the manure spreader of subjectivism. He is what Aquinas is to sound philosophy and theology. He is to all of the putrid thinking of the 18th century and 19th century and our own century. Freedom of thought and all of the crazy things that we have now that are even against common sense. He is the author of all of that mentality of subjectivism.
And you're not talking about the salubrious effects of manure on growing things. You're talking simply about the...
Yes, just the spreading. Yes, he was a very evil man. I mean, not to say that he was a womanizer or anything, but his writings have had a terrible, terrible effect. All of the philosophy, the typical modern philosophy of the 19th and 20th centuries, is ultimately based on Kant.
We have Descartes.
Oh, he's the father.
All philosophical works are banned.
Yeah, he's known as the father of modern philosophy, and he too was the one that began this idea that all knowledge begins in your head. And therefore cutting you off from reality, you see, and that it's all of these preconceived notions that you have in your head. And, he was the one to do philosophy. He said, I have to completely redo philosophy, as if Aristotle didn't get it right or St. Thomas Aquinas didn't get it right, I mean, look at the pride in that person. And he put his hands over his head in front of his fire, but just like his head in his hands. So not seeing anything. It's very symbolic how he did it. And he discovered everything in his head. And he was the one that said, I think, therefore I am, which is an absurd, absolutely absurd. You could as easily say, I burp, therefore I am. And I won't go into it, but it is an absurd principle. It's not, it means that because there's a higher principle than that. He said, this is the first principle, I think, therefore I am. The higher principle is that there must be a faculty for thinking in order that I think something, and that is my intellect. And therefore, if in my thinking, I have a faculty, but the faculty presupposes the soul, etc. It is not the highest principle. So, I mean, he was off right from the beginning. But the symbolism of covering his eyes to begin modern philosophy is it's very symbolic. It leads to subjectivism. All of our problems, this lack of common sense, where there was a priest here from Ireland recently who said that in Ireland they recognize now 72 genders. I mean, that is sick. That means your mind is sick to say that there are 72 genders. And
your mom would be pretty upset about that.
I mean, where do you begin? I mean, it's like an insane asylum. If you said what, you should call the police or something. There's some sort of, you need to be, you have problems, or call a psychiatrist. I mean, 72 genders. Yet this is a once Catholic country saying that there are 72 genders. This all comes from modern philosophy, that you could think some stupid thing like that. You see.
Well, some people may be horrified hearing some of these names, Your Excellency, because they'll say, oh no, Your Excellency, I read those in college. I didn't know anything about the index. Am I in trouble? Do I need to go to confession?
No, because the index was done away with by Paul VI, I believe. And so, also there was common dispensation given to students commonly. In other words, you have to know your enemies. So the church studied Kant and read Kant and studied all of these philosophers and all the enemies of the church in order to respond to them. See, so you read Garrigou-Lagrange, he criticizes Kant, and he wrote a whole book against Kant, God, His Existence and His Nature, which is an excellent book. Obviously he read Kant, and he had the ability to do that. So there were, and you had to ask the bishop of the diocese for this dispensation in order to read a certain book.
I noted that in this book, it gives you a template for how you can apply to the bishop, and it says, Your Excellency, and then my reasons why, and then there was a time limit to it. It wasn't an indefinite permission.
Right.
I'm working on a book. I need to study this for 6 months, and the bishop could say no to you.
Yes, he could. And you couldn't go to another bishop without mentioning that you were refused by your own bishop. Just to,
Well, I'm thinking that relates to, Your Excellency, the normative thing of having faculties to hear confession in your own diocese. You didn't have the ability to just hear confessions wherever. You had to obtain those faculties.
Yes, but it's a little different. It was in other words, you couldn't go bishop shopping. The bishop of this diocese would forbid you, but you had to inform the bishop of the next diocese if you wanted to, that you were forbidden to in your first diocese, your first attempt. It's just so he knows, what. And he might say, "Why were you forbidden?" etc.
So now we're in this period, Your Excellency. Obviously, Paul VI's suppression doesn't matter to us, but what we can't apply to our ordinary for permission to read these texts in this period.
We don't have an ordinary. That's why.
So what is the principle that lay Catholics should consider when looking at books like this, since they can't?
Well, strictly speaking, according to law, in the absence of the ordinary, they could use something called epikeia, which is that if I have some specific need to do this and I don't think that I would be scandalized by reading this, I could read it. But I would say they should get the advice of a priest, in other words, because not everybody should be reading this. There's a famous example of Will Durant, who was raised a Catholic, and he read some awful book, some book of modern philosophy, and he fell away from the faith. He wrote that big, many volumes of the history of the world, And so that's an example of that. Books are corrosive. We have to have the humility to understand that we can easily fall.
I mean, it's extraordinary here. The story you see, it's repeated here in this text. Will Durant, in his autobiography Transition, has pointed out an indiscretion when a condemned philosophical work caused the loss of his own faith, and he could find no justification for its presence in a Catholic library. And I think people don't take that seriously, Your Excellency, that you could come across it. I don't think people realize the power that books can have, that such a situation can happen, that someone can read something and all of a sudden something moves in their brain.
Yes, that's right. Especially in an untrained person, a young person particularly. I mean, say a priest who was well versed in all of modern philosophy and theology, or the whole. I mean, Father Disposito, for example, teaches modern theology.
He's got to subject himself to some of this horrible.
And you have to be very, very firm in the faith. But a young student could easily, if he doesn't have a strong Catholic background, or he could easily be misled.
And seminarians can't just casually peruse through.
No, but again, there's no index, there's no bishop to consult. So we have something called the Hell section, which the Jesuits always had in their library, and it used to be under lock and key. And you had to get permission. If it was something on the index, you'd have to get permission from probably the Jesuit superior.
When the library was in Florida, I thought there was a lock or...
Yes. Well, we're still in the process of working our library, sorting things in our library. But yes, we had that. You had to ask, So, but
they would need that for maybe a research paper, or
yes, to defend the faith against the naysayers. The church is always doing that, and the more they say nay, the more we're saying yay.
Speaking of which, so a Holy Father that's held in high regard at Most Holy Trinity Seminary, St. Pius X. In 1907, Pius X suggested that the local ordinaries establish in every diocese a vigilance committee composed of priests to investigate books harmful to faith and morals and to prevent their circulation. This assignment was extended even to those works which carried an imprimatur in 1907.
Yes, because all the imprimatur means is that the bishop is saying there's nothing contrary to faith in this. That doesn't mean he's necessarily approving it. It's just saying there is nothing contrary to faith, but it could contain many errors that lead to denial of the faith. And usually it was not read by the bishop. It was written by his censor, who may have been more or less sensitive to certain things, and so
Or sympathetic to.
Yes, you never know. So the imprimatur doesn't mean that everything in it is true. It's just in the opinion, I'm going to say, of the censor and with the approval of the bishop, but he's not reading all of that stuff. When the censor says it's okay, he's going to put his stamp on it. But that doesn't mean it's infallibly true that there's nothing against faith in there. You see, so you have to be cautious, and that's why I think he probably saw that some books were getting imprimaturs that should not have. That must be the reason for that. So the Diocesan Vigilance Committee would review these books.
And your house rule, which you've communicated to me for many years, is 1950 is your cutoff in terms of if you see an imprimatur before 1950 or before, you can feel pretty safe about it.
Yes, I would say pretty safe. I couldn't absolutely guarantee
1850, maybe a little better. 1750, even better.
But the 50s were a time of transition. So some works were still very good. Some very having a tendency to modernism, and but they were still careful at that time.
But after 1950, this is just
all hell broke loose. I mean, after 1960, you forget of it. So, but you have to know your author. But there were some very good works that were produced in the 1950s.
Well, overall, Your Excellency, as we wrap up the episode, I think hopefully what lay people can take away from this, those who are watching or listening, is the index is simply there as a guide, as a guardrail, but perhaps the larger message that's being communicated is that as Catholics, we have to be vigilant. There was a Legion of Decency. There was an Index of Forbidden Books. The Church was vigilant about culture because, as you've said, culture is the great teacher of minds.
It is.
And we can't always trust the teacher of minds. We have to have Catholic guardrails in place.
Yes, before the Reformation, the church was the culture, you see, and so there was not so much of a need for that. But the culture changed to a very humanistic, naturalistic idea from the Renaissance on until now. We just have the reign of the devil. So the church should have actually bolstered its we might say its war on the modern culture at Vatican II. That should have been the whole purpose of that council, was to get stronger in the protection of the faithful against the modern culture, and in all sorts of ways. But instead it married the modern culture. It was the marriage between the church and the modern culture, and look at what has happened.
Well, as always, Your Excellency, thank you for your time.
No, not at all.